Hey, Tim Frisch with a Frisch Perspective here, bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun from a Christian nerd's point of view. So I thought today it would be fun to talk about something that is kind of an issue, especially when you're talking about Bible translation, but even in general in English language and how we write. And I just want to give a disclaimer, if you don't like topics that get into a little bit more academic stuff and what I call nerdy stuff, then this probably isn't the video for you. It may not even be the channel for you. But what I'm going to talk about is pronouns. And I'll be more talking about pronouns in relationship to the Bible. But really in general, when we write, what kind of pronouns do we use? And one of the topics of discussion is, should we use male pronouns or should we use something that's more generic, or do we alternate between male and female pronouns? And I'm thinking, in a couple ways. One, in terms of how we write in English, but also when we're doing Bible translation and we're reading the Bible, how do we address that issue? I want to clarify, too, that when you talk about pronouns like he and him or her or hers, something like that, we're talking about people. When you're talking about God in the Bible, the male pronoun that typically is used and the one that you will see in major Bible translations would be things like him, he, his, male pronouns. But when it comes to people, that's what I'm talking about. When it comes to how do we talk about people, and, obviously if we're talking about a specific person and it's a man, we're going to use a male pronoun. So Adam and his wife, Eve. So his is a male pronoun referring to Adam, the man. Eve had a child. Her child's name was Seth. So because Eve is a woman, we would say her. That's a female pronoun referring to a specific woman. So, that's pretty straightforward. The question is, what do you do when you're just talking about people in general? Specifically, when you're talking about one person, but you mean it generically. But, there are instances where we see words that might mean men and women, but they're more of a masculine word. So I think of the word brothers. And it's a big question when you're doing Bible translation. Do you translate that word as brothers directly? Even though the word in the original language can refer to men and women, you can see the conundrum there. If you translate it literally, then people in English might think that you're only talking about men, when in reality you're talking about brothers and sisters in Christ. So these are issues I've brought up before, but specifically with pronouns, I think that some people are very comfortable with using generic pronouns, and one way to do that would be to use like a plural. Even though you're referring to a singular noun, you're still going to use plural in a generic way. And we do this all the time when we talk. We'll say, a person should bring their clothes on the trip. Even though you just said a person, which is one, their is, typically refers to more than one. But the reason we do that is so that we're avoiding saying should bring his clothes or her clothes. Now, if you're like me, and a lot of you probably grew up being taught English in a certain way, especially when you're writing, a singular noun has to have a singular pronoun. So really the correct way to write that would be to say a person should bring his clothes on the trip, or a person should bring her clothes on the trip. Traditionally, we use male pronouns, and the same with the biblical languages. They use male pronouns a lot. when they were talking about generically people. And so we see a lot of examples of this in the English language, but also in biblical languages and even in other languages. So I just want to make the case from my biased, and this is just really a matter of, I guess, subjective way of looking at it, but I still personally lean toward the male pronoun. You can kind of see why, even in what I'm talking about here. Again, it was drilled into me that correct English, this is how you write. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the biblical languages use male pronouns, so I tend to want to go with what I see in the original language, and if we're going to translate it, keep it the same as what was in the original language. But I understand the issue today because English is changing. We're becoming more sensitive to how we use pronouns, and we're obviously very, very careful about doing things that just come across as being, overly male-oriented, and that includes how we speak. So I just want to make the case, though, for male pronouns here, and going to give some reasons why I prefer them, especially when we're translating the Bible. The first one is that singular male pronouns, when we're using them generically, make for better English, which I've already talked about that a little bit. But I want to give some examples. I would refer to this as something that you see in the NIV. So I would refer to this kind of as the NIV problem. Now, I know a lot of people like the NIV. The New International Version is very popular, and I'm not bashing it. But when they did the update in 2011, they were really trying to move to less gender-specific language. They wanted to be more generic in which pronouns they used. But the problem is what that does with English, which I've already been addressing here. So let's look at some examples in the NIV. I'll show you how this plays out when they tried to be generic. I'm going to compare it in these examples to the CSB. And in Matthew chapter 10, for example, verse 37, it says, "The one who loves a father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The one who loves a son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Anyone who finds his life will lose it. Anyone who loses his life because of me will find it." So that's the Christian Standard Bible. And the Christian Standard Bible doesn't feel the need to use generic pronouns all the time. So it actually says there again in verse 39, anyone who finds his life will lose it. Anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. Now, if you compare all of that to the NIV, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. So I know this is being a little nitpicky, but aside from the fact that, the original language was using more male pronouns, generically speaking, it also doesn't really read as well in English when you say anyone and then you all of a sudden switch to their, plural. Now, is that horrible? No. This is just, one reason I'm giving. Let me give you another example. This is from the first Psalm. And let's go to verse 3. The CSB, again, not trying to be overly concerned with which pronouns. It says, he is like a tree planted beside flowing streams. And that's referring generically to any person who is walking in the right way. He is like a tree planted beside flowing streams that bears fruit in its season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Now look at the NIV here. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water. So you can see already they're trying to avoid he, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Who's they? That person. Now, I understand we do this all the time in English. So those of you who are English speakers, and whether it's your first language or second language, you will hear people do that all the time. I was talking to someone the other day, and they said to me, they? How many were talking to you? But the reason we do that is maybe we want to, not refer to a man or a woman. And maybe in some instances, we don't want to give away who it was we were talking to. So we keep it generic. And even though we said I was talking to one person, someone, we will say they said to me. So there's different reasons we might do that, but basically that's kind of how we do it. So I understand why the NIV did that. But all I'm saying here is it doesn't make for as good English, and it's also, not as directly tied in with the original biblical languages. But I'll get to that. So that's the first reason. Number two, male pronouns, I would say, are more consistent and actually generic. Now, I know in one way male pronouns aren't generic, because if you look at them at face value, it's like, well, actually that's referring to a man, and yet really you might be talking about men and women. I get that. But, just as an example of what I'm talking about here, there was a woman I was listening to on a video the other day, and she was talking about a movie director. The movie director was actually a man, but then when she started talking generically about movie directors, she switched to a female pronoun. And it just seemed weird to me. Here she is talking about a director. I understand why she's doing it, but it just sounds weird. Why not just continue? You're talking about a specific director who's a man. Okay, and then you say when a director directs his movie, why do you have to suddenly say her? I know this has a lot to do with of avoiding sexist ways of talking and that sort of thing. I get that. But it just struck me as actually less consistent. And here's an example of something I think that could happen. If you're giving hypothetical scenarios and you've got to choose a pronoun. Now you're talking about something that could happen, and it could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. So let's say I'm giving a couple of examples and I say, well, here's the right way to do it. And then I start talking about the generic person in the masculine. And then I say, here's the wrong way to do it. Now, to be fair, I have to switch the pronouns to female. That would be even. On the other hand, the problem is that if it's a good example and I'm referring to a man, and now I'm giving a negative example and I'm referring to the feminine pronouns, it could sound actually, like I'm purposely using the female pronouns for negative examples. So now I have to be careful about when I use the female pronouns. It just seems more generic and consistent just to always use the male pronouns. I suppose one could argue it's more consistent to just always use the female pronouns. I guess if a person chose to do that, that would be within her rights to do that. But I'm a traditionalist, as you can tell. So I think that's the second thing. Male pronouns just allow us to be more consistent and actually more generic. Number three, this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize. They're always arguing as if people can't understand when you use a male pronoun that you're talking about both men and women. They think if you use a male pronoun that, it's somehow confusing. I really don't think that's the case. We actually still use masculinity in generic ways. Just recently there was, a new Men in Black movie. Now, think about that title. It's Men in Black. But is it only men who are involved in that organization? No. Actually, one of the lead characters in the most recent one was a woman. So, why aren't they calling it People in Black? Do people not understand? And so they have to change the title? No, people understand. It's just generic, right? Men in Black sounds fine. I still would argue in English language it makes sense sometimes to use men and masculine words, masculine pronouns especially, to refer to men and women. Another one would be, a straw man argument. Now I know that's just a compound word, and this is kind of a weird example, maybe not the best example. Maybe I'm raising kind of a straw man argument in some of what I'm doing here. But anyway, a straw man refers to, right, a flimsy argument, but why only man? I mean, isn't it really something that could be a straw woman too, But, we stick with man. I just feel like maybe we're overdoing it sometimes when we're trying so hard to change how we use our language. I think a certain amount of modification is okay, but maybe we overdo it. Another reason that I think masculine terms can be good is because other languages use generic masculine terms. So as far as I know, this also applies to a language like Spanish, where they're going to use a masculine term if they're referring to men and women together. If they're referring to only women, then they use a feminine term. So it's something that you see in other languages, not just English. So it's more consistent with other languages. Also, most importantly to this discussion, it's more consistent with biblical languages which use generic masculine terms. So I think that's a big issue, and probably the biggest issue for the discussion that I'm talking about here, which is how do you translate the Bible? And in my opinion, for all of these reasons, I think it's better to use these generic masculine terms. So that's one reason that I like translations that do that. Even the Christian Standard Bible, being a pretty new translation, and has included terms like brothers and sisters instead of just brothers. They didn't go quite to the extreme that the NIV did, from what I can tell. But I still like the traditional ways of doing it, where we just use the masculine terms. Now, I'm not extreme about this. I just want to kind of close off all of this to say this is not, to me, the most important thing in the entire world. I know it can ruffle a lot of feathers if someone's a more traditional person. They can really hate it when there's more gender neutral type language. I don't mind to some degree, being mindful of how we use terms and being more sensitive to maybe, let's not overdo the masculinity, right? I get that. But I think there are people on the other side that their feathers also get ruffled if you use masculine terminology, and they're just hypersensitive to that. And I'm just not hypersensitive. I think we should just not be so extreme about this. If we can be more generic in the way that we talk and write, that's great. I don't have a problem with that. I just don't like contorting our language, where it's suddenly, you're writing things that no longer sound right, or that they seem inconsistent, and sometimes end up being less clear. And as in examples that I could give, maybe you end up running into other problems. Even though you're avoiding the initial problem, you run into other problems. So, I mean, you get my point. I just think at the end of the day, for me, male pronouns are a good thing. When we're talking about generically using pronouns, I'm still in favor of using singular male pronouns when appropriate. So that's my view, my first perspective on this, and some of you probably agree, or at least somewhat agree. Some of you probably totally disagree, and I would love to hear what you think. So leave comments below this video. Tell me what you think. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching.